Wireless LAN Professionals Podcast, episode 114.
Wireless LAN Professionals is a place to educate, inform, encourage, and entertain those involved in wireless LANs. This Wireless LAN Professionals podcast is an audio manifestation of these goals. Our host is a wireless LAN veteran, consultant, designer, and teacher, Keith Parsons. And now, the podcast for wireless LAN professionals by wireless LAN professionals.
Hello, podcast episode here with Sam Clements, Blake Krone. We happen to be in the ECHO offices, and we had a little time, so I thought we'd get together and talk about something that has nothing to do with ECHO. How are you guys doing today?
I'm doing quite good. It's good to be here. Good to see you.
Blake?
I'm doing well, too. I'm not sure if it's good to see Sam, but it's good.
So regardless, it's good to see Keith.
It is always good to see Keith.
We're getting it video recorded as well, so there is a video chat of this as well. We'll see if we can get that posted sometime. Well, now that we have all of us here, we recognize each other. How about if we get started with an actual topic? Maybe 2 years ago at WLPC, there was a question of the CWNEs on site of RM. What do you think? And it was all the old guys. Me, Rick Murphy, Peter McKenzie. And to a person, they said, well, it could work really good, but doesn't, and we usually went static. That's not your opinion, so let's give you guys a chance, those of you who are CCIEWs as well as CWNEs, and talk to us a little bit about your idea, one, about the value of RRM and how you go about implementing it so you get really good results. I think part of what Rick Murphy came back with one of his answers, and it was a pretty decent answer, is he just spent a lot of time fixing bad RRMs, so that kind of taints someone's opinion. You guys have good RRM experiences, so I thought I'd bring you on the podcast and talk a little bit about how to make RRM a good experience.
Well, I think to start things off, we should clarify the term fixing bad RRM actually means that you should take the time to fix the algorithm, which is what we want to talk about, which is the tuning, doing all the different advanced tuning parameters, making our design a network like you would design it if you were going to do static channel planning. There's so many times that you hear the phrase, I fixed RRM by doing static.
You didn't fix anything.
You replaced RRM.
Yeah.
I wanted to start off just by saying that a lot of people, when we quote unquote fix RRM, you're replacing RRM with something else, which doesn't mean you actually are fixing RRM. So I think the fixing of RRM out of the box is probably going to have issues. What'd you say, Sam? Maybe 80-90% of the design scenarios out there?
Well, yeah, and the challenge is that it's going to not work for 80 to 90% of the environments because 100% of the environments aren't going to be the same. There is no one typical environment, and so as a manufacturer, if you put yourself in the shoes of the Cisco, Aruba, Ruckus, pick a manufacturer and say, I have to have some set of defaults on this box when it leaves my doors. What are those defaults going to be? It doesn't matter what answer you pick, it's going to be wrong for the vast majority of your deployments because not all of your deployments are going to be the same. So invariably, what comes out of the box is not going to be right for you. Not
Correct.
Invariably. I would say the overwhelming majority of the time, you're going to at least need to minimally go consider what are the defaults and do they apply to me or do they not apply to me?
And what are the things that we're looking at when we are doing a static design? We're looking at power constraints. That's probably, I would say,
power and channel.
Well, I was getting to the channels, but I think first and foremost, everybody's looking at it as from how do I constrict my cell size? Most everybody always looks at it in terms of I'm going to reduce my transmit power because that's the one thing that I have that I can really easily do to constrict cell size. So they're going to start to reduce your power levels. So when you're deploying something like RM, by default, the default settings are the max and the min are the entire range that is allowed by your country code, by your regulatory body. So, of course, to fix RRM or to actually properly deploy RRM, let's focus on in the first place, what's the first thing that you need to do? You should tune RRM to constrict your transmit powers, your maximum, your minimum transmit powers, to match what hopefully you did either a I know a lot of people don't like using the word design associated with predictive, but a predictive design, or that you did with an AP on the stick survey, or however you designed the infrastructure, you set some transmit power on those access points, right?
So what's the default that when you open up out of the box Cisco RRM? How broad of a power does it allow as default?
Negative 30 to positive 30 dB.
Just a small little range.
Just a little narrow window.
And so if you don't touch that dial, you're left with this huge, what is that, 10,000 times?
Yeah, it's a massive window.
And depending on how you turn up your environment as well, if you turn up environments where you are bringing APs in a staggered fashion online, now you potentially have a lot of APs that are going to lock on in Cisco LAN. They're going to lock on to channel 1 and channel 36 and be power level 1, and everybody else that comes online, they may stick to channel 1 and 36 as well, depending on what's going on and how you're deploying it. And then they're going to start to gradually change their power. So you're going to have some APs at power level 1, some APs at power level 8, and it's because you didn't tune it. So
now for those people, just to fix what you just said, for those people who don't come from Cisco LAN, power level 1, power level 8, can you put that into dB or milliwatt?
No. you put it into that by looking at the controller and seeing, because there's so many different factors that go into what the actual dB or milliwatt value is associated to power level 1, based off of things like regulatory domains, channels, which model access point it is, antennas, internal versus external antennas connected to it.
Can you genericize that, like saying power level 1 is the loudest that's possible in the regulatory domain with the antenna that you have?
Yeah.
And then power level 2 is?
Well, actually, not even with the antennas that you have. So when we look at the controller, and we say, at least in Cisco land, of course, we're talking. This conversation has been heavily centered towards Cisco. A lot of this isn't going to necessarily apply to Aruba or Ruckus or whomever else, right? But in Cisco land, power level 1 is maximum supported. It's basically as high as the radio can go. Loudest for
in the country that you're
in your country and on your channel, sort of regardless of the antenna attached, because the AP doesn't. In most situations, the AP doesn't understand what the antenna is, so you have to know what that value is. So 1 is max, 2 is half that, 3 is half that, 4 is half that, 5 is half that, 6 is half that, all the way on down.
Basically a 3 dB loss on each step.
Every single time.
Yep.
Yeah. So 1 is the loudest. Somewhere around 8 is generally the quietest.
Okay, sorry, just to interrupt, but some people don't know where Cisco comes from.
No, yep, that's it's true. So there's a lot of things that come into play, even in terms of, like, if you would go and you would do the tuning of RRM, there's things that come into play in how you deploy your APs and how you do your rollouts and how things are set up ancillary to just even RRM tuning that is going to possibly impact the success of your RRM deployment. And I see that's what a lot of the stumble-ins and a lot of the failures sometimes are, is just even how things are brought up, or things like, not knowing, because it's not something that is widely known, that, if you bring up a 12-story hospital or 12-story hotel and you do floor by floor by floor by floor, once everything's up and running and all the APs are online, you should go to the command line and do a DCA restart, so that you kind of kickstart it and tell it to restart now that you have everybody and everybody's there, all the APs, all the radios are up, and it's going to help try to normalize it a little bit better, as opposed to the staggered approach of bringing things online. So there's a lot of things involved in RRM that aren't really realized by people, and that's where the problems really come into play, is because for the longest time, it has been this mystery cloaked in hidden algorithms and hidden logic. And if
well,
you knew
I don't
the
know if it's
person,
hidden, because they've got some good documentation.
Well,
it's just so robust that it's still hidden because people don't take the time to learn it.
To learn it.
Now we've got the RRM guide that was wrote by Florwick and others at Cisco that is provided, I think, everything that you need to know to understand how RRM makes its decisions. But the fact of the matter still remains, you have to tune it. You need to set the parameters. So what are the things that you can tune to make it successful? The first one is constricting the minimum and the maximum transmit powers. Set those to realistic values.
Do you set that by putting in min or max, or putting in a differential? Like go up and down
There
one
are
power
a
level or
handful of
something.
ways to do that, and so I think I wrote a blog post. What was it, like 2 years ago, about the number of configurable options, in at least in Cisco's RM at the time, was a number that had something like 15 commas in the number. There's a staggering number of total RM combinations that you can possibly configure, and there's a bunch of different ways to do it depending on what your comfort level is, what your goal is, how you want to get to where you want to be in order to manipulate your infrastructure. And yes, you can set a cap, you can set a max and a min, and you can just say, hey, no radios quieter than this, hey, no radios louder than this, and you set those to make things more complicated. You set those in dB.
Not in power levels.
Yeah. Which won't necessarily reflect itself in power levels as you would necessarily think on your radio power level pages. So yeah, there's absolutely a max and a min that you can define. There is also a neighbor threshold that says so the way RRM works in Cisco land is based on neighbor discovery packets. Right? We have an AP that every minute sends out a packet that says, hey, I'm a neighbor. It sends that packet at max transmit power. And all the other APs hear that packet, and they punt those packets up to the controller and say, hey, I heard this neighbor discovery packet at this volume, assumed to be the max. And based on this volume threshold, I'm going to make a series of decisions about how I set my power level. We can change that threshold at which the neighbor message is heard, and we can change
from
that
a
threshold.
timing basis.
No, from a signal strength perspective.
Oh, okay.
And we can say, hey, the default is, when you set it at negative, when the default is negative 70 dBm, and that means decision X, Y, and Z manifests itself in this power level. You can change that number up or down in order to influence your general power level pool to come up or go down, depending on what it is you're looking to accomplish. So there's two major ways, I think, that we influence RM decisions post-implementation in order to corral the power levels that we use, is what I would say.
Is there a better best practice?
Always.
To rather than the defaults sound like they're open really wide, even if you don't know that much about RM, is there some basic way, because just your description of that was fairly complex from configuring it.
I think the important thing is the starting point. If you survey with your AP on the stick, or if you did a predictive design and you say that the maximum transmit power in your design was, I don't know,
25 milliwatts.
Yeah, 12.5 milliwatts, 25 milliwatts, whatever. And you survey with that value, that right there is typically your max. That's what you should set your max to. Mm-hmm. So now you've got the high value set. You've got that high water mark set now because that's what you did design for. And that's actually what I would say most everybody doesn't do. They don't start with that first value, because you designed for a cell when you did your predictive or your AP in the stick, and that was your starting point. So that's where your maximum that RM should be allowed to do. It should not go any higher than that. So set that as your high water mark. Maybe set it one increment higher than your high water mark. So if you are designing for 12.5, maybe go to 25.
Maybe go to 25. Yeah.
Just because that allows RM to do some of the things that we like it to do, which is temporarily provide coverage in the event of a failure. There's some things that we want it to do. So, but you have to tune it and you have to corral it, and that's the first and foremost. That's the easiest starting point to do, is take a look at what you did on your design.
Set a max.
Set your max based off of your design, because that's your starting point in any design, right?
So you started with the first was power. What's the next thing you want to look at?
Well, I would say before you do that, before you jump off into that, because cell sizes are when we design, right? When we do the building blocks of an RF design, it's all about cell size. Cell size first.
By the way, I'm just sad this is an audio podcast, because your hand movements are really helping to describe what you're saying.
I agree.
But we got a video.
We have a video, yeah.
And so when we look at those cell sizes, and we paint our picture based around cell sizes, and then we do an implementation, we have to remember that RRM's first goal is to protect itself. It's going to be to protect the infrastructure. It's going to be to make sure that when RM comes up, it's not doing something stupid from the infrastructure's perspective, because that's the only perspective that it has. And so from where I sit, RRM is going to take a more conservative look at the infrastructure, and it's probably going to run cooler than what most people think it should, just because RF goes all over the place. Yep. Most folks don't take into account what APs to APs see as far as the RF is concerned. When you're doing a survey, your design, you're measuring it 1 meter off of the floor. Rarely are you measuring at the height of the APs, and you're looking to see what the AP to AP measurements are. So there's some tuning and there's some logic that you have to apply to it to say, okay, I know that RRM is going to take a protection perspective first, meaning I'm going to change channels, I'm going to change power levels so that I keep my noise floor low, I keep my CCI low, I keep all of these other good healthy things low, and leave it up to the implementer to say, I'm going to override you and I'm going to sacrifice some CCI for coverage generally across my area, and I'm going to do that based on my lower value.
So that protection mechanism you're talking about, protecting itself, may cause client side issues.
Yeah, for sure. Because how do you protect yourself with a bunch of infrastructure APs or infrastructure radios on the same channel? Well, you turn down your power. Well, when you turn down your power, you create coverage holes. You can create coverage holes if that power goes lower than what you intended your design to be.
Right.
Is there a metric, a mechanism in the RM algorithm that allows for that client feedback to say, oh, wait, as a client, this is what I'm seeing?
Yes and no. I think the client feedback into the infrastructure has always been a contentious one, because there is no standards-based way to do it. Nobody wants to step in first and say, hey, this is how you do it.
Well, Cisco did with CCX over a decade ago.
Well, so CCX 5 included client feedback into the infrastructure.
And that was a licensed product.
There was a
you had to pay a license
CCX
for it. Yeah. So... Yeah.
So today there is still CCX 5, and then iOS 11 promises to give us a client perspective at association time, what the client sees, and then eventually we would like to see that roll into more intelligent RM decisions. The problem is that since it's not a standards-based way of doing it, you have you have a large volume of people saying, well, Intel adapters don't support it, Android devices don't support it, nobody's going to support it, therefore it's not standard, therefore we're not going to take advantage of it because it's an Apple iOS-centric view of my infrastructure, and maybe I don't want my iPhone to be the premier citizen on my infrastructure.
But wouldn't you rather have some client feedback than no client feedback?
There are some folks who say, no, don't give me any client feedback. If it's going to be the iPhone that takes precedence and sets the tone for my network, don't want it because it's non-standard.
Yeah, and even across, then how do they calculate the values too? What is the vendor using to calculate their RSSI values? How is that performed? What metrics go into that? There's so many differences in there that the client feedback side of things is an interesting one for sure on how much is that going to impact your network. I think in terms of what we have control over of what we can do besides the power, or the other next best thing to do for your RM tuning is to utilize AP groups and constrict that neighbor messaging, because your neighbor messaging is going to be inside of an AP group. So if you could start to control some of that through AP groups of, there's a whole sort of different philosophy between, should I have an AP group per building, an AP group per floor, an AP group per area? I don't think there's one correct answer for which way you should do it, but I think utilizing AP groups is certainly in your favor to help tune RM and get RM a little bit more under control.
As I'm sitting here listening to you talk, the thing that I find fascinating is that we live relatively fluently in the RM world, and you're right. There's the what is it, the 300-page guide that Jim wrote about how to tune RM, right? But we see some of the largest naysayers in the industry going, you know what, that's too complicated. I'm gonna go instead read the 600-page IEEE 802.11 standard.
It's 3,400 pages.
3,400 pages, right? So they're gonna go dig into bits and bytes requirements for 3,400 pages of the standard, but they're not going to sit down and take the time to read the 200 to 300 page guide for Cisco that represents, you know, a large percentage of the wireless infrastructure uses in the world.
Because RM never works.
Because it's got a bad name or whatever. Admittedly, marketing at the very, very beginning set the tone very poorly with the RF engineer in a box. That didn't work, and that sent. I think that's probably where it started being bad.
And I think having followed behind many Cisco sales guys to fix this bad RRM, it's my customers are saying, oh, they just told me all I have to do is turn it on. And this isn't like 10 years ago, 5 years ago. This is just this year, recently. And when they were complaining, their sales guy goes, well, did you turn it back on? After we fix it, it's working for a year, and then you just need to turn this on. Turn it on, it makes it worse again. Because it was never tuned in the first place.
Yeah, I think the big thing about it is that RM tuning is so important to being a success that it's been lost because, yes, the marketing message always was, just turn it on and it's going to work and it's going to do everything. Because in 10 to 20% of the environments, I bet you it is going to work just fine. But there's so many complex environments out there that RM is blindly turned on and not tuned. Yes, it's going to fail. A static channel plan is going to look better because you didn't tune it. Now, if you get to the point where you tune RM, you take the time to learn and understand how it's going to work. You use things like the WLC config analyzer to look at your show run from the controller and see what the values are that everybody's picking. You can really start to see how to tune this to make it work, so that chances are it's still not going to do. I will say is that it's still not going to do as good of a job in some people's eyes as a static plan is going to be, because they want consistency and they want it to be the same. But I think it's going to get yourself so close to that where I can at least dynamically support some failures and some issues that pop up, which is what people want.
Yeah.
People don't want to have to, that AP failed. Crap. What does that mean? Does that mean that I have a coverage hole in here now and I need to go and redo my static plan? Because they don't have a Keith, a Sam, a Blake, a Andrew, a whoever on their staff that is doing this in the event of a failure. If you can tune RM, you can get RM to get yourself, 99% of the way there to a rock solid design. It's going to help when you have failures, and it's going to help.
And not just failures. The bane of our existence. Well, one of the banes of our existence is transient sources of interference. Right? I've got a microwave that shows up on channel 11 spontaneously. Well, what happens when somebody goes and buys a new microwave oven and they put it into a place? You want to have somebody to come back out and restatic your entire wireless network, because now I can't use 11 in this one spot. That seems pretty ridiculous in my book.
Yeah, that's where things with like the clean air chip being able to detect interference sources and letting you know, there's different sensitivities in there. So as we even grow from RM traditional to the flexible radio assignments, which we've done papers and podcasts on talking about the benefits of that system, and then things like event-driven RM with clean air detection of spectrum interference sources, it's not replacing us. It's not replacing our brains. It is allowing our brains to stay on site when we leave once it's properly tuned.
Allowing our intentions to stay on site.
That's a good one.
Hopefully you didn't leave your brain there.
No,
no kidding.
But they're all, everything is a tool that you have access to, and how you use that tool is important. Whenever I'm teaching these CSEs, I always talk about static channels versus RM designs as there's not one right solution for every deployment. There are certainly times where I look at a site and I say, you know what, I just don't think that we're going to get RM to be tuned to do what we want it to do, so it makes more sense to set static and set power. But then there's other environments where you look at them and you say, there's no way that these people are going to be successful with their design and with their client devices running statically because of, like Sam said, transient devices that come in, that pop up and go. They come and disappear. They cause a problem for a couple hours and then leave. They're non-persistent. So can we have a system that is built properly to try to work around those issues or try to help us and keep. I like your word of keep our intentions there.
It's I remember as a kid, I grew up in California. You can drive across country, and you'd start at sea level in the California coast, and you'd drive up over the Rockies. And the car we were in was carbureted air fuel mixture. And
you're what? That old.
I am, oddly enough, yes. I am, and my dad's cars are that old. And so you'd be driving along, and you'd get to the top of the mountains, and you know what? Car probably wouldn't run all that great because the air fuel mixture and the tuning of that carburetor was meant to operate at sea level. Mm-hmm. And so you get to the top of the mountains, and you maybe adjust your carburetor a little bit here or there, and then you move on down, and then as you come back down out of the mountains and you drive across the plains, guess what? It doesn't work that well again because you tuned it in the high altitudes, and so you got to get out and you got to tune it a little bit, and then you drive across the country, and then as your elevation changes, the needs of your air fuel mixture and your carburetor change. That is the way that it used to be. If you had a car, you knew how to do that stuff. And you know what? You knew how to go statically configure your car to work best in your environment. But you know what? Today, we have fuel injection systems. We have computer-controlled air sensors. We have O2 sensors. And we have computers that do that work for us so that when we drive and we change elevation or we change environments of our vehicle, the vehicle responds to our needs as we need them. I look at RM as being that. Yeah, sure. You want to have a carburetor. You want to get out and tune and tinker with it. Have fun. Go for it. More power to you. The rest of us, though, we're gonna drive fuel injected vehicles, and we're gonna let the computer do the work for us.
And I guess it comes down to the trust issue. I trust my car's sensors to do a good job.
True.
I don't know if I trust RM to do a good job because I've seen it fail lots of times, not because I think RM fails. I just know for sure it wasn't ever tuned, and the default's going to not work as well as it tuned. So we talked about
I had a 1984 Cadillac. The fuel injection systems did not work for a damn.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we talked about you need to tune power, perhaps AP groups. What are some other things that you can tune, some of the big nerd knobs to make some changes in how RM works?
Event-driven RM, do you want to...
Well, I would say even channel lists. I mean, there's a million different ways to go. But if you talk power first, it's typically channel second, and I think those two things obviously work together to make your network
20/40/80
channel width.
I think it's beneficial, and we should point out the fact that a lot of things. Again, you hit on it with the marketing earlier. Marketing is driving some of these things. Well, one of the things that marketing is driving, in particular in Cisco LAN, for a while there was their DBS, their dynamic bandwidth selection, which was a component of their DCA, their dynamic channel allocation, where if you set it to where it would say, okay, we're going to have this be an automatic channel width to try to maximize performance of being able to allow 80 megahertz channels to be utilized. It's an interesting idea in that we're going to allocate 80 megahertz of channel to this radio, and on each packet transmission we're going to send out a RTS packet on 20 megahertz of those 80s so that we can see how much of it can we use. Can we use all 80s? If we get CTSs, if we get clear to sends back on all of our 20s, that means we can use the entire 80 width. If we only get it back on 40 of it, we can only use 40 of it. If we only get it back on 20 of it, we can only use 20 of it.
And that's per packet?
That per frame. Excuse me. I always do that, and everybody always corrects me, and I'm like, yes, I know. Per frame, we choose to do this RTS CTS exchange to see if we can.
But the answer of the dynamicness of the bandwidth changes frame by frame by frame, rather than a sounding that says, 80s are good here, let's stay with 80s. It's actually, and so a different client would, depending on where they are compared to an AP, would change dynamically.
Would change dynamically. So all these things sound great, again, but they're components of this that you choose to enable or disable to impact the performance and impact how RM creates its layout. So if you're in an environment where you don't need the extended bandwidth that 80 is going to offer you, limit yourself to 40. Or if you're in a LPV, maybe it's better to limit yourself to 20.
But roll even back to I think what you were going after, which is what are the out of the box things that we should look for from a channel planning perspective that may be the low hanging fruit. At least in Cisco LAN, Uni 2E is not enabled by default, so that's half of the spectrum. If you're in an environment where you can use those channels, that's probably something that I think gets overlooked on a regular basis, especially sort of out of the box.
I think that's a really good example of someone at Cisco said, yep, this is probably the best practice, coded it in, became a default, and then now people are following it, whether or not it's an actually good thing to do at that location.
And best practices is just that. It is somebody that said something is a best practice. I could go out and write a blog post that says these are best practices, and slam my hand down at the end and say, you know what, you're all going to do it this way because it is the best practice per Blake. And you're going to do this if you want success in the network. And as long as I speak authoritatively on it, it's going to be assumed that is the...
And you are a big deal on the internet.
Appropriate. I know. I got the t-shirt that says it. The running joke. As long as you say it and you are standing by it, somebody's going to take that as the word. So you're right, Keith, in that somebody sometime said, you know what, DFS channels support, it's too risky. There's too much possibility of you having to change channels, and we're not going to support it. And I actually think, it's kind of interesting bringing it up, is because I actually think that the DFS side of the channel assignment algorithm, they have to be so cautious about using those channels so they don't get fined that, yes, we have seen overzealous changes because of false positives in DFS events, which if you're running voice, that might be problematic for you. So I think I'll slip you your royalty here in a second, Sam, but the answer is going to be, for a lot of things, it depends on what you can do in your environment of what makes sense for you to support. And RM out of the box is
conservative.
Well, actually, I was going to say that it is too conservative in things, and it is not conservative enough in other things.
The power has a huge range, and yet you have a small channel plan.
Right.
Yeah. So there's too many highs and lows in there that are not going to be normalized.
And just to bring it up, this is not a Cisco only issue. Ruckus Channelfly has an issue that if you don't adjust the channels, you get 1, 2, 3, 4, 5s right next to each other. And everyone complains going, look, that's a terrible implementation. It's not that Channelfly failed. It's the guy who designed it that failed. Right. Same with the Arubas
For sure.
Yeah, no, I think anything to do with any of the radio resource management, the automatic radio management, any of the algorithms out there, you've got to take the time to tell it what you want it to design to.
When you're deploying a firewall, you don't just say firewall on.
You set up the rules.
They wish it would.
They wish it would.
And if firewall, say some Nokia or some other checkpoint came along and said, you don't need to know firewalls, just hit this easy button.
Hit the firewall button.
I think we're getting a lot of feedback from those marketing terms, making it sound like it's that easy. No one in the firewall world would say that, and yet in the wireless world, we could just. In fact, they've gone so far as you don't even need a design. Just put up APs, and then
that's right.
The automatic thing will fix that as well.
Yeah, Sam, you remember back to the very early years of the partner training events. What were people? There were certain people that were always asking for stuff. They were asking for these RF engineer in a box tools. And I think it was funny is not too long ago, we were having sessions and we were having QA sessions. We were talking about this. And I think one of the comments was made, well, you guys asked for this. And I raised my hand and I made the comment back, certain people asked for this. Do you see them present in the room anymore? I think wireless is one of those technologies that if you really want to be involved in wireless, you have to be taking the time to go out there and read the information about how these algorithms work and how, we're sitting in Ekahau's office. What's one of the things that, we could go and do right now is we could go over and we could talk to the scientists behind the visualizations, and they can explain how they're calculating things. And it's important that you take the time to understand those things, because any tool, any product, anything out there is going to show you exactly what it is being told to show you by you. So you need to take the time to understand how things are being done, to be able to not manipulate, but be able to define the design or define the requirements to output something to you.
Look, it's know your tools, know your skills, know your products. You give a man a Les Paul, he doesn't become Eric Clapton. You have to know what it is you're doing, and you have to start somewhere, of course.
Oh, yes.
Yeah,
So where would someone go, just in talking Cisco world, where would you go for training on how to tune RRM?
Oh, they don't have any of that.
There's no training. There's you go and you download Florix guide, the RRM best practices configuration guide
We'll put the link of that in the show notes.
Just updated actually with 8.4 information in it. So you go there, you download that, and that's where you start to at least read to get an understanding from Cisco's perspective.
I would say Jim's guide is obviously king of the hill, right? The Cisco live videos have been done over and over and over again. You can go download, last year's Cisco's live videos. They have sessions.
Which those are free.
Those are free. Yep. Yeah, absolutely. Go, if you don't have gear, go grab a virtual controller and download it and install it and run it in a VM environment if you don't have access to the resources, or if you don't have access to physical hardware boxes, go download a virtual one and install it and run it. It's the same controller code, same RRM algorithm, same control plane stuff as a bare metal controller, and you can at least fire up a controller and look at the options and say, oh look, I see X, Y, and Z. Go lay your hands on the gear, right? If you're a hands-on learning kind of person, do all three of those. And I would say that the naysayers in the industry haven't done any of those.
I think the naysayers, and I would claim I've fixed a lot of RM by going static, not because I didn't want to learn RM. It's just you're on site, they have a problem, I can fix it. I can fix it in the next 10 minutes.
Yep.
But then again, I get paid for doing that. Part of the RF in the box idea is to get rid of people having to pay me, and I have incentive the other way. So,
yep.
But I think the naysayers, we don't want to single out anyone. There's a lot of people who don't use RM because they don't know how to tune it. So that's why I think it's good we're talking about what are the things we need to tune and how do you learn it.
Yeah, the guides, the videos, that's all your starting point to learn what you should do. And then once you're ready to really get into understanding how, what's its decisions process that it's making, how to actually fix RRM and apply proper min-max values or groupings or whatever else you want to do, that's where you go and you grab the wireless LAN config analyzer, and it is going to show you a lot of information
about your deployment.
And yes, it's got all these other best practices and things that it's going to tell you about, but the things that you want to look at is you want to look at the RX and TX neighbor messages and information to see what did you use yesterday when we were talking about the SIM? Your hit point, because you can sort by
hit list.
your hit list. You can sort by how they're hearing and what's the highest worst RF performance according to the WLCCA, which is the controller stats. It's reading the controller stats, and there's your 10 APs that you need to go at least and look at and say, these are really bad. How can I fix these? Which is probably going to help fix other things in the environment as well. And the key is that this is an iterative process like everything else in wireless design. Yeah. So you make a change, you're probably going to then have to survey after you make that change. That should be obvious, I hope, to everybody, is that you're going to have to go into a survey to see, was the change good or bad? And there's things inside of Ekahau with the differences in signal strength that you can use to be able to see an A/B comparison to see which way you're tracking. And then after you've done that, you're pulling another WLCCA, you're pulling another show run to be able to put into WLCCA, and then you're looking at those values again to see, is my hit list getting smaller? Is it getting larger? Which way am I going? What do I need to tune again to keep going down? It is an iterative process.
So this tuning isn't a hit the
magic button.
Magic button and go, that was easy.
Yeah, there's no auto tune on here that's going to make us sound like T-Pain or anything. That's not going to happen.
What is it with guys? They want the magic button. WLCCA also has.
Hi.
I'm not going to touch that one.
Go there.
WLCC, the Wireless LAN Controller Config Analyzer, WLCCA for short, also includes a graphical representation of what your AP neighbor messages look like.
Yep.
So you can see which APs see other APs. And I've seen a large number of deployments with hundreds of APs, and they all see each other. It's this big relational picture that shows lines going to all the APs, and it's like if you pull that up and you see these one AP can be seen by 50 other APs in your environment. You know what? Maybe you got too many APs. And WLCCA is a great way to answer that question.
There's no such thing as too many APs.
There is such a thing as...
No, there's just too many radios turned on.
Such a thing as too much RF. How's that? And that's the thing, is that a 5 gigahertz design and a 2.4 gigahertz design rarely include the same number of radios in an AP being turned on. Sometimes you have to just suck it up and turn off a radio for the health of the RF.
Let's talk about both the FRA new version of RM versus the old version. If you are running an old version FRA, sorry.
How many TLAs can we cram in
this
conversation?
If you're running that and you manually turn off 2.4 radios, the rest of it just figures it out on their own, and they're good. In FRA version, can it make that decision and turn off a radio rather than just down?
It can. It's one of those where you would say, where you probably wouldn't start out of the gate like that. You would probably start out of the gate and say, hey, controller, tell me what you're recommending for me to do. And it'll give you a recommended role. It'll say, hey, I've looked at your environment, haven't made any changes, but I recommend this radio state to be off, or this radio state to be something else. I would probably not just sort of out of the gate go, yep, just unleash FRA on your environment in new code with new APs and new flexible radio and blah. I would probably take a bit more conservative approach personally and say, when I do my deployment, I'm going to let it bake, let it settle, do my aggressive restarts. I'm going to come back after a day and I'm going to say, okay, you've had time to think about this. I'm going to pull a config, run it through WLCCA, and I'm going to go back and I'm going to say, what do you think the radios should be off? And then I'm going to go back and I'm going to sanity check it before I sort of unleash or hand the reins over to FRA for my deployment.
Unleash the Kraken.
Yeah, that too.
Well, great. Thank you for your time today talking about RM. And again, this was a generic, we talked about Cisco LAN, but the same issues are in every vendor's version.
Yeah.
So recap. Blake, what are your top 3 things you should do to tune Cisco RM?
Power, neighbors, and channels. I'd say it's the top 3.
Sam?
Static channel.
Static channel, static power.
Read. I'm a fan of the neighbor message threshold values. I'm also a fan of if you've assessed your network and it's too cool, then maybe you need to spread your APs a bit further apart. Maybe you do have too much coverage, and I think it's easy for us to oversaturate a network. So I'm a fan of neighbor message thresholds and then actually adjusting physical quantity of APs. But max and mins I think are absolutely low hanging fruit.
My take from this is learn what you're doing. Don't just come out and say RM's good, RM's bad. RM is just another tool, and if you have to know the tool, you can adjust it. And the best one, and all of us have mentioned, this is an iterative process.
Yeah, for sure.
There is no little magic button that says, "Oh, that was easy." We need to learn what we're doing and apply it appropriately. Well, thanks for your time today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thanks for listening to this episode of Wireless LAN Professionals podcast. If you have any feedback, questions, ideas, go ahead and leave comments in the show notes on WLANpros.com. If you'd like to be interviewed, you can also follow up with Matthew at WLANpros.com. That's his email address. And until next week, thanks for listening to the show.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of the Wireless LAN Professionals Podcast, the podcast for wireless LAN professionals by wireless LAN professionals. Be sure to follow us on Twitter at Wireless LAN Pros for all the latest news and updates, and also connect directly with Keith on Twitter at Keith R. Parsons. Head over to www.wlanpros.com for this episode's show notes, as well as the latest in all things Wi-Fi.